She was starving when she knocked on his door. Her shoes were worn to the threads, her lips cracked from the cold prairie wind, and her stomach so hollow it ached like a gunshot wound. Nobody had ever taught her how to beg, but life had taught her how to trade. And that night, with her body trembling in the blue dusk of the Montana hills, she offered the only thing she had left, herself. He opened the heavy wooden door and looked down at her. A tall rancher, broad shoulders, weathered skin, eyes as sharp as a hawk's. He didn't ask questions. He just stared, as though she were a ghost blown in with the dust storm. She whispered with a trembling voice, "I'll cook. I'll clean. I'll warm your bed, if you'll give me food." It was not romance. It was survival. The silence stretched, heavy, like the pause before a trigger is pulled. He didn't reach for her. He didn't smile. He just stepped aside and said, "Come in." The ranch smelled of tobacco, leather, and loneliness. She sat by the fire, hands shaking as he brought her a plate of beans and cornbread. She ate like a wolf, tears running down her cheeks as she swallowed every bite. He watched, leaning on the mantel, his face unreadable. She expected him to take her upstairs right after. That was the price. But instead, he set down his whiskey glass and said, "You're not sleeping in my bed tonight. You'll have the guest cot by the stove. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll see if you can cook as good as you say." Her heart jolted with confusion. She had sold herself cheap, but he hadn't collected. The next morning, she rose before dawn. She baked bread, fried bacon, brewed coffee, and set the table like her life depended on it, because it did. When he came in from the barn, smelling of hay and horses, he sat down without a word. He ate, slow and steady, then finally said, "You'll stay here. Work for your keep, but don't offer yourself again. You're not a woman for hire." She stared at him, speechless. No man had ever told her she was more than her body. Days turned into weeks. She scrubbed floors, mended his shirts, gathered eggs, and cooked hearty suppers. At first, he barely spoke to her beyond instructions, but sometimes she caught him watching her with those storm-gray eyes. One evening, as snow pelted against the windows, he came in carrying lumber. He dropped it by the far wall and said simply, "You need a room of your own. I'll build it." Her breath caught. Nobody had ever built her anything. She'd always been passed from hand to hand, treated like a stray mutt. And now this man, who owed her nothing, was hammering boards and shaping a place for her in his home. When the room was finished, small but warm, with a bed, a quilt, and a window that looked out over the hills, she cried. She pressed her forehead against the wood and whispered, "Why are you doing this for me?" He didn't look up from his workbench. He just muttered, "Because you deserve more than scraps." Winter deepened. They lived under the same roof, silent most nights but comfortable in their shared rhythm. She cooked and cleaned. He worked the ranch. And sometimes, when the lantern light flickered low, she caught herself wondering what it would feel like if he did kiss her, if he did touch her, if he did claim her as his. But he never did. It was spring when the trouble came. 3 men rode up, reeking of whiskey and hunger, their eyes wild with lawlessness. They pushed through the door without knocking, laughing, spitting, and slamming their boots on his floor. One of them, with a scar down his cheek, leered at her and said, "Well now, ain't this a pretty little thing? Didn't know you had company, rancher." She froze, heart racing. The rancher's jaw tightened, his hand drifting toward the rifle propped against the wall. "She's mine," the scar-faced man said with a grin. "Women like her don't belong in houses. They belong in beds." He reached for her wrist. Before she could scream, the rancher moved. In one swift motion, he slammed the butt of his rifle into the man's chest, sending him sprawling across the table. The other 2 lunged, fists flying, but the rancher fought like a man with something worth protecting. She grabbed the cast iron skillet from the stove and swung with all her strength, catching one outlaw across the skull. He dropped, unconscious. The last man bolted, dragging his wounded friend out into the night. When it was over, the ranch was a mess of broken wood and blood stains. She stood shaking, skillet still in her hands, staring at the rancher as he caught his breath. He turned to her, eyes blazing, and for the first time, he grabbed her shoulders and said, "No one touches you. No one. Do you understand?" She nodded, tears blurring her vision. That night, she couldn't sleep in the room he had built for her. She crept to the kitchen, where he sat alone, sharpening his knife. She whispered, "Why did you fight for me like that?" He looked at her as though the answer were obvious. Because you're mine. Her heart thudded. Yours. He set the knife down, stood, and walked over. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, worn with age. Inside was a simple gold ring. Her breath caught. I didn't build you a room just to keep you as a servant, he said, voice low, steady. I built it to keep you safe until I was sure you wanted to stay. I don't want your body for trade. I want your hand in marriage. Her tears spilled over. She had never dreamed a man would offer her a ring instead of a bargain. Yes, she whispered, trembling. Yes, I'll stay. The rancher slipped the ring on her finger, his hands rough but gentle. And for the first time since the world had turned cruel, she felt she belonged. The days that followed were different. She was no longer just the hungry stranger who had knocked on his door. She was his wife. She walked the ranch with her head held high, cooked meals with laughter in her chest, and even learned to ride beside him in the pastures. But the West was never gentle for long. Word spread about the woman at the ranch, and whispers of her past followed. Men who once knew her called her names, spat on the ground, said she was nothing but a drifter, a body for sale. One night, a note was nailed to their fence post, "She don't deserve a ring." She found it before he did, her hands shaking as she read the cruel words. When he returned from the barn, she shoved the paper at him, tears streaming down her face. "They're right. I ain't good enough for you." He ripped the note in half without even reading it twice. He cupped her face in his hands and said, "You listened to me. You walked into my home half dead, and you gave me more than you'll ever know. You're not ashamed to me. You're the reason I fight, the reason this house feels alive. Don't you ever doubt your worth." That night, he carried her across the threshold of the very room he had built for her. Not as a servant, not as a beggar, but as his wife. The spring rains came, the ranch bloomed green again, and so did she. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was loved. And though the West was full of whispers, bullets, and storms, she knew now that she would face them all with him. Because when she had nothing, she traded herself for food and shelter. But the rancher, he had given her something no hunger could ever steal.